Hello there and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another project from the vault. That's right, today I have another formerly Patreon exclusive project to share with all of you here on the channel, showing how I made the yellow tricolor silk Dupioni jacket that I wore last year in my video Arcana. And the style lines of this jacket are actually directly inspired by a Terry Mugler piece from the late 1980s, which I can get into a little bit more once we jump back in time and over onto the blue patterning table of doom. And of course, as usual, I start with my basic bodice blocks here. I will be tracing a copy of my front onto some alphanumeric paper, as per usual. I have two darts that I'm going to eliminate into the double princess seam today, and I'm actually going to make my jacket close at the center front in the end. I think I have this overlap a little bit. You can see me, I'm drawing in a 1-inch overlap here, but in the end, I actually don't have this jacket overlap to close. The Terry Mugler jacket actually has snaps, so it overlaps a tiny bit, and it has Terry Mugler's trademark snaps. They often put snaps in their front of their jackets. I would say actually most of the time, the fronts of the jackets snap. As per pretty usual when I'm creating a jacket or any sort of outerwear-ish garment that I might wear a t-shirt or a blouse underneath, I'm going to go ahead and add a 1/4 inch along my side seam. I'm going to tip the shoulder seam up that 1/4 inch and then bring everything out a 1/4 inch up there as well. Blend that down into my arm side, which I'm going to lower the 1/2 inch. You've seen me make modifications like these before. Anytime I make a blazer or a jacket, usually use something similar. I will start by adding on this same sort of like grown-on stand collar that I have been using often over the last year. Again, you just come in from the neckline a 1/2 inch and then come up 1.5 inches and curve that down into the shoulder seam. So you've seen me do that before. This is going to be a little bit different because this collar is a little bit taller and a little bit extra, I guess, compared to the normal little grown-on collar I've been adding. And thinking about where I'm going to want to put my princess lines, I am going to actually move this dart over about 1 inch. So I'm measuring down here to make sure that's about 1 inch. I think it's like 1 1/8 inches. So I'm going to move my dart over here at the waist. I can, of course, shift that anywhere from the apex, so I'm just going to move that towards the center front. And for my first princess seam, this does kind of come in like those princess seams that I quite like that come up into the neckline. This princess seam goes up into the neckline, which actually becomes part of the standing fold back collar. So I'll draw a line parallel with my center front from like the height of my collar down to the neckline, and then an angled line from where that hits my neckline down to the apex. So that's my first princess seam. For the second princess seam, I'm going to draw from my shoulder seam down here to the waist, just crossing right over that side dart. I'll close that side dart before I separate these two pieces, but this is where this is going to go, and then each of these pieces are going to have some of this dart fullness taken out of them. So just refine that style line, putting it where I want to. Again, this is not a needed style line, like I don't have to put in this second princess seam here. It's just part of the Terry Mugler jacket that I will be copying for my version today. I'm not going to be doing any of the fancy shoulder and arm work, like sleeve work that Terry Mugler jacket has. I'm just copying the style lines for the main body of the jacket, just because the shoulder on the Terry Mugler jacket is a little, actually too 80s for my taste. This jacket is from 1988, and I do think it's this rather large rounded shoulder on this jacket that would tell you it's from the 1980s. Let's just start labeling everything here, because I will have 3 pieces for the front here. The sort of centerpiece, the side piece, and then the front piece. Start cutting everything out, like so. And we can start doing some manipulation. So I'm going to cut apart my first center front princess seam bit, I suppose. And I can cut away my dart. We no longer need that dart fullness. Goodbye. It is now part of this style line for my princess seam. Of course, I need to add seam allowance here. I will close my other dart as well, which will take care of that extra fullness still in the rest of this. And again, I don't need the second princess seam here. It's just there for style reasons. So I'm going to cut that apart here. Just kind of smooth over wherever that curve got jumpy, like so. So now I have my 3 pieces for the front, the center front piece, the center piece, and then the side piece here with my double princess seam, ready to go to create the shape I will need in the end. But I of course need to add seam allowance so I can sew all these pieces back together. So that is what I will go ahead and do here next, using scraps paper, taping everything together, putting that 1/2 inch of seam allowance on all 3 of these pieces. Like so. All right, so we have the bodice separated into these 3 pieces, A, B, and C here. Just so I don't get confused, I do have the grain line marked on all of those as well. The original grain line, everything's just matching up with the center front. For the back, I will just trace a regular copy of my bodice back here, but instead of having 1 inch down the back for a zipper like I would in a dress, I'm going to leave this with 1/2 inch down the back because I do still want a center back seam. Then I need to make the same modifications to this piece that I did to the front, adding that 1/4 inch along the side seam, that tip up and out 1/4 inch along the shoulder, and that dip of the arm side 1/2 inch. Now I'm going to grab my front piece to see how far I brought out this collar and the princess seam here, because I will add a princess seam to the back of the jacket by dividing this center back piece from the side, like so. The Terry Mugler jacket is actually simpler on the back than it is in the front. Of course, in the end, with all the embellishment I do on mine, that is no longer the case. Now for the back of this style of collar, I do need to tip it out 1/4 of an inch, and I will add seam allowance along that as well, just to give room over the curve of the back and the back of the neck. Of course, I also will be leaving this little bit of area open, just because I like the way the collar looks. It has some Dracula ribbon points, as I like to say. And the Terry Mugler jacket does not have the back of the collar open. It is done a little bit differently, but again, this is me giving my own twist on this style here, updating it for my own personal wardrobe, I suppose. And again, I need to separate my princess seam of my back here, so I can cut away this dart. Goodbye. It is now, the footwork of that dart is now incorporated into this seam line, the princess seam here, so I'll add seam allowance, again, so that can be sewn back together. Tape down my floops. We're doing well. We got our front bodice and our back bodice now converted into this jacket style, although I did forget to add notches along these princess seams in the front. So that's a bummer. Let me go ahead and walk my seams back together and mark notches for those so that I can sew these together properly later and know where they're supposed to match up. Oops! You can see I'm using Sharpie for this because it will go ahead and go over any of the tape that I encounter on this journey. For here, I'm just going to mark the apex on each, and that will be my notch for this side front pieces. I think some sort of water heater just came on in the background, so I apologize for the industrial noise as usual. For those of you with good headphones and or who are listening to me on speakers very loud. Now, in the same way you've seen me do for many jackets now, I'll be using my A-line skirt pattern to create this jacket from the waist down. So I'm going to go ahead and trace the top of my A-line skirt front pattern here so I can start adding on to my front bodice pieces. Just tracing, again, maybe the top 9 inches or so of my A-line skirt, like so, and I will actually draw in the seam allowance at the waist here on both the skirt pattern and also on the bodice pattern. I am going to go ahead and add that same 1/4 inch along the side seam that I did for the bodice, because of course the skirt needs to match up, and therefore it needs to be the same with the side seam. Now this front piece, I'm actually going to overlap the seam allowance at the waist where it would be sewn and just tape that shut, because I want to eliminate the waist seam along this first center panel. Drawing in my style lines for that as well, I'm going to kick out just a tiny bit. So I'm adding a tiny bit of flare. Instead of drawing this line parallel to the center front, I'm drawing this seam line flared a tiny bit. I'm going to even just adjust my angles here. Of course, I'm just making this up as I go. So I will have to make sure that I like everything once I have a mock-up of this going, like so. And now this front piece is extended. You can see I'm cutting it out along the style line I drew. I will still need to add seam allowance to this piece so that it matches up with the seam allowance of the rest of the piece at the top, and also so I have room to sew it back together to the rest of the peplum of this jacket. And on the Terry Mugler jacket, both of the frontmost pieces on the front of the jacket do not have a waist, but the side piece does, and that is because the side piece is usually the curviest, which you will see in a moment here. I need to add seam allowance where I cut this away from the rest of the skirt as well, so that it can be, again, sewn back on. So I still have the rest of my A-line skirt front to work with here. I'm actually going to go ahead and have my second piece here. Again, because my waist is so curvy like this, as you can see, I'm not going to layer the waist seam closed on my second piece. You can see here is what I'm talking about. There's no waist seam on the Terry Mugler jacket, but I'm going to have one on mine. I could probably get away with eliminating it, but I don't want to deal with the tiny bit of curve in here and moving that around. So again, I will just add a seam line to my A-line section here, making sure everything's still matching up. Where do I want this point to be? Of course, the front of this jacket is quite pointed, so I'm going to draw that in, just sketching away here. Again, deciding on the fly. This is not done with any sort of mathematical precision, as you can probably tell. I'm just drawing it in here the way I think it needs to be. That's the thing about pattern drafting and designing as you go is, there's no right way to do it, you decide. So this jacket actually stands up and cups away from the body quite a lot, especially on the mannequin. On the runway, it seems like a little bit less dramatic, but I was looking at the museum shots as opposed to the runway images when I was making this. So I'm going to cut this out. I've added a tiny bit of kick along that side seam over here, and then I'm going to add more flare along the separation of these two pieces. So before I add seam allowance, I need to add seam allowance here, because you can see this jacket stands up away from the body quite a lot. It's actually a very Dior technique that was part of the Dior New Look that Mugler, of course, is referencing here as well. It's all layers of referencing, as all fashion is. So I'm going to add about a 1/2 inch of extra flare to these pieces in between them, so that when they get sewn back together, there's an extra 1/2 inch of flare that wasn't there before, because the A-line skirt is only so flared. So adding a little bit more in here, and then of course adding seam allowance, because again, we need to have these pieces get sewn back together. Really probably could have eliminated this seam. That curve seems less dramatic now that I'm looking at it in retrospect here. And you can see I need to walk this seam and really fix this curve, because after adding seam allowance, something got out of whack. So I've just fixed that up. And again, tape down my floopies so nothing gets caught on anything and ripped, because nothing is more frustrating than that. You can see here now, where this will be stitched, everything lines up correctly. There we go. And I was thinking, to kind of go along with that Terry Mugler jacket, do I need to add even more flare to this? So I was thinking I'll separate this piece and add in some flare. I do believe after the mock-up I take this out. I'll have to remember along with you. This was a couple of weeks ago. I don't quite recall. But I do think I take out this extra flare. But you can see I'm just adding wedges of fullness here along this piece to flare this side skirt peplum-y bit a little bit further. And again, using scraps of paper for that and taping things down so that nothing gets too unruly. So here on the front, we have our 2 peplum pieces that will hopefully cup out over the hip, and then the front peplum piece is all in one with its bodice piece, more like the Terry Mugler jacket is. It's easier to pattern draft something and just keep the waist seam right where it is. But I have a large differential between my bust and my waist and my hip, so my seams at the waistline are a little bit curvier than some people's are. If they're straighter across, there's no problem layering these closed, which is how a lot of runway fashion is, because a lot of runway fashion is made at a size 0, and so they're not necessarily worried about running into hourglass curves like I am. They're usually, adding this flare onto the peplum and stuff like that to cause the illusion of a greater hourglass, whereas sometimes I run into having quite enough hourglass all on my own. But for the back peplum here, I'm actually going to eliminate this side seam between the side front peplum and the back peplum entirely. So I'm going to use the front as a reference, and then I'll draw my seam allowance on both pieces and layer those closed. Again, anytime you do have a straight line, you can layer those bits closed. Just line them up along the stitching line, and you're good to go. I'm going to add some extra flare along this piece, actually a big pleat, sort of a triangular pleat, you'll see what I mean when we get to the sewing of this. Where the princess line of the back will align with the peplum is where I'm putting this little pleat here. And originally when I'm doing this, I'm thinking I'm going to have this be a separate piece along this point, like I'll have a seam line here. I'm just going to fold that pleat in the paper the way I want it to be, and then I will tape the rest of this together. So I'm just imagining, I'm kind of draping with the paper right here a little bit. Instead of measuring it and deciding that way, I'm just folding the paper and deciding this way. Drawing my seam allowance here, because again, I'm still thinking I'm going to have a seam here for some reason. I don't know why. There's no reason to do so. And since I put a seam allowance on that piece, I better put some on this piece as well for my center back peplum-y bit. Like so. And again, seeing as that is a straight line, I can eliminate that seam later. I'm going to have my center back close about 3.5 inches down, and I'm actually going to sew this pleat closed about maybe 2.5 inches at the top here, and then the rest of it will hang open and free like this, so that it is a fun little open pleat along the back of my peplum, as it were. I don't really think of jackets as having peplums. Peplum to me, by the way, I don't know what the actual definition of peplum is where these sort of pieces stand up away and have more fullness than the body. If a jacket just fits the body closely from the waist down, I don't think that's a peplum. If it's circle cut and it starts floating away from the body a lot more, that's when I think it's more of a peplum. I just call these pieces peplum pieces because it's easier for you to keep track of where on the jacket I mean. It's really just the jacket from the waist down, but that's a lot to say anytime I'm referencing a piece. Now, of course, we are still going to need some sleeves for this, and unlike the Mugler sleeve, because again, there was a lot going on with this Mugler sleeve, a lot of cutting going up at the shoulder that I wasn't replicating today, I'm doing a more traditional sleeve, I guess. I'm going to trace a copy of my regular sleeve pattern that you've seen me create here on the channel. I will go ahead and draw some guidelines for myself here, so that I can go ahead and separate the sleeve cap and add a little bit of extra puff to the top of this sleeve here. Instead of having the sculpted shoulders of the Mugler jacket, I'm going to add some puff at the top of my sleeve. This is actually a subtle leg of mutton sleeve, I suppose is what they call this. Of course, when I hear leg of mutton sleeve, I think of the giant sleeves of the 1890s, which is not what I mean. I'm just going to use that same sort of technique to add a little bit of puff to this. And for the lower part of the sleeve, I'm actually going to eliminate this dart, and in doing so, create a bit of flare at the back of this jacket. It creates a little bit of a bell sleeve, but instead of doing the bell from the very top of the sleeve cap, it's just starting the flare of the bell sleeve from the elbow down. And it's just using the amount of flare that gets taken away for the elbow fit normally to create this dart. It's the same as like creating an A-line skirt in some ways. Like you close a small dart somewhere, it opens up a larger dart somewhere else because of the distance covered. Geometry is happening here, but I don't know about any of the numbers. I'm going to fill this space in here with some more paper. We now have a little bit of flare to the back of the sleeve. I'm of course going to dip the hem of the sleeves down to really exaggerate this little bit of a more fantasy tinged sleeve, which of course goes well with Arcana and the rest of the theme that I have going on here. Makes this a little bit of a dark fairy jacket, in my opinion. So I'll just add on a little bit of dip to the back of the sleeve there, add on seam allowance for that. And again, I have lots of loops in the back here to tape down into place before they get caught in anything and rip my pattern. That's why I always go through a lot of tape. But I can cut this out. So you can see I've drawn a line perpendicular to the center line of my sleeve from one side to the other here, the front to the back of the sleeve. And from the center of my sleeve, I've come out 2 inches either side on the sleeve cap and drawn angled lines down to the center point. I'm going to cut down the middle, down over to the sides, like so. And then I will cut down the other angled lines I created as well, leaving a tiny bit of paper at all these hinges so that I can play around with how much fullness I want to add and hinge these things open and close. You can add a lot of puff doing it this way. You can add a little bit of puff doing it this way. I recommend adding at least an inch where that center point where all the lines met, adding at least an inch there. Otherwise, you're really not going to totally notice. It'll start to look like, if you don't add enough puff, it almost looks like you just made a mistake. And if you add too much, of course, there is no such thing. So you can add as much puff as you would like, but you kind of do have to add a minimum level of puff. So you can see here I've marked an inch up so that I can realign all these pieces with that inch of extra fullness across my sleeve here, which adds about a ½ inch between all these pieces at the top of the sleeve cap. I do need to come up an inch at least additionally from that and draw a new sleeve cap in here. So you'll see me do that in a minute. Like so. I came up about 1.25 inches here at the center of my sleeve and just ease that back in, drawing those curves into place. Especially if you're making a mock-up, I recommend just not having fear. Of course, I'm confident doing these things now because I've been doing it for a long time. And I've made many jackets that have gone well, I guess, at this point. I make a lot of blazers in life, if we can call them that. Mine are a little bit less office ready than usual, perhaps. More ready for the cocktail bar than the office, which are 2 places I never go, so that's too bad. But kind of the only way to get to the point where you're confident about doing this kind of thing is trying it a few times. And especially if you're going to make a mock-up, give it a go. Add a bunch of puff, see if you like it. You can always bring these things back down if you don't. So after I made a mock-up, I decided to change a couple of things here on the pattern. So I decided to go ahead and change how this was going to close up. Of course, again, I had this originally with a 1 inch overlap. I'm going to change that to just a ½ inch of seam allowance here along the center front, because I am going to have this have a center front closure with a placket underneath. It's how I've been doing a lot of jackets recently, and I really do like it. Also, the Cherry Mugler jacket itself has a very slight overlap with snaps, as I said, so I felt freer to use any closure I wanted. It was also in the mock-up that I decided I might leave the back of this open just because it created these lovely points in the back, and I was going to go ahead and add a little bit of flair to exaggerate those points. And again, as I once said in a video, being silly makes it look like it has Dracula ribbon points going on. So doing a little bit of that back here, just adding a point to the top of this to give it an even more of an evil villain flair, because we can't have too much of that. Now, I did decide that on this peplum piece, this flare in the front was too much. So I need to go ahead and take this apart, take my extra out, and reposition this and just take that flare away. So I added that extra flare into the side front peplum piece, and I'm just going to go ahead and take it away and close up these wedges of fullness that I had added in, like so. Readjust everything. Now I'm also going to go ahead and close this piece here. So again, I had added a seam here. I don't even know why. We're closing that up. It's not actually essential, so we're getting rid of it. It's not even seen because of this pleat, so goodbye. And this pleat will go in here, and this piece will finish up looking like this. I'm going to sew on the inside to close that pleat down. I'll show you that when we get to the sewing. I decided to just go ahead and adjust the point of the back of my sleeve here just a little bit as well. This brings it a little bit more towards the center, or a little bit more towards the front of my sleeve, where this will point down. And that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of adjustment I really can only know that I want after trying on a mock-up. So I cut this whole thing out of a single layer of stiff muslin and tried that on, but very helpful for knowing what little things I wanted to change before I dove into the Yellowjacket silk. And for this silk, of course, I wanted to go ahead and interline this. So for the peplum pieces, for the back peplum and like the side of the peplum pieces, which are all now in one, of course, I cut those out of a light green organza that you'll see later, silk organza. So that's a very stiff but very lightweight silk, very crispy. That was going to add a little bit of extra help for those peplum pieces. And then for the rest of my main body of my jacket, I cut the interlining out of cotton muslin, a thin cotton muslin. And then here, just for the center front pieces, I'm going to go ahead and just straight up interface these with a light fusible interfacing. Because again, this is where I was thinking, at this point, I hadn't actually decided totally what I want to do with the center front closure. So I was thinking, if I end up doing any sort of nonsense, I want this to have a little bit of strength. The only nonsense I did was some hooks, so no big deal. But I didn't know if I was going to do loops and buttons at this point, but I decided that I didn't want to have to fiddle with making tiny loops in this rather fray-happy silk. And for the top of the collar on these back pieces, I also wanted to go ahead and reinforce those just to give them a little bit more stability. So I'm cutting a tiny bit of fusible interfacing out of this and just kind of rounding off the end of that, just because I want to go ahead and interface the very pointy tips of this, just to give the silk a little bit more stability again, because this tricolor silk Dupioni, it's a little bit thicker than the regular Dupioni by like a couple micrometers, but it does, because of the texture of it, it's quite slubby. It does want to fray, so you have to be kind of careful. It's a looser woven silk than, say, like a taffeta for sure. And again, anywhere I have those very pointy bits, I'm going to just do a little bit of interfacing. So I'm using the front lower peplum as a guide here, just to be able to reinforce this point, especially because the point on the other side of this dip is interfaced as part of that front piece. Hopefully you'll see what I mean. And you can see right now I have forgotten to take the filters off of my camera lens, so there's a lot of shine going on with the pin dish, and that is because I forgot to take the extra filters off of my camera. I have like, you can get filters for like polarization or different effects, and I have a star filter as well that does this effect in both directions, so you get little stars everywhere and things could be sparkly. But I have a smoke, like a atmospheric effect filter on the camera, and then also a glimmer glass filter on the camera, which again is kind of a glimmery effect. And those are on the end of the camera right now because I had just filmed the first part of the lookbook, and I was working on the garments for the second part, as you can see. And I forgot to take the filters off when I went back to filming the sewing. Eventually I realized, and then I'm like, oh no. So we don't have to have extra atmospheric sewing, although maybe that's a good thing. As you can see, in the end, I decided to interline the front pieces here with some muslin as well. I'm hand stitching those down into place just like I do when I'm sewing my Victorian garments. Even though I did fusible interfacing on this, I decided to go ahead and add the muslin layer as well, just so that even though it's a little bit crispier thanks to the fusible, it isn't a different thickness than the rest of the jacket. And here's that green organza that I was cutting out, that I happen to have a half yard of here in the sewing room that I can use to go ahead and stiffen these back peplum pieces. And again, I will hand baste these using a beading needle and some cotton thread. I ran that through a little bit of beeswax, and I'm just basting around 3/8 of an inch away from the cut edge here, trying to be very careful because again, this Dupioni silk does want to fray. Honestly, more than this organza does. And I'm just doing a running stitch along most of this, and then if there's an area where I feel it's particularly prone to fraying, I will actually just do a whip stitch, as you can see here when looking at that piece that's underneath my tattoo. You can see how that top curved edge there, it's actually whipped around the edge for basting that. That's just to help that Dupioni stay in place before things are finished. But I finally get to start sewing, and I'm going to go ahead and start by sewing my center back of this, leaving the last 3 inches of that collar again open so that it points dramatically behind my back, the back of my neck. If I had a tattoo on the back of my neck, it would show it off very well, but I do not. Or at least I do not yet. Who knows? I never know what I'm about to get up to, honestly. I'm going to go ahead and stitch the rest of my peplum pieces together here. Since the back and the side pieces are already together, I have this one more little side piece for the front that I need to stitch on before I can sew these to anything else later, so just getting this done with. And I can start sewing some of my princess seams as well here. So because I haven't done it yet, I do need to mark in my notches so I can match these pieces up properly. I'm just using a colored pencil for that, especially because I have muslin on the back of these. I really have no shame about marking them up because no one will ever see this muslin once the jacket is all together. And this being a Dupioni silk, this is not a garment I would ever wash, or at least like not like throw in the wash. If, you know, something disastrous happened with some like exploding jar of jam or something, I would attempt to hand wash this maybe. But in general, this would be a dry clean only jacket just because it is a completely silk jacket. But I would also just wear something underneath it to absorb anything from my body so that the jacket hopefully just doesn't get that dirty, you know? As long as you're not leaning back on a dusty bench all the time and you are wearing something else underneath, the same way that people in the past used to wear a chemise under everything to collect any sweat, etc., any body oils, keeps all that away from your fancy outer garments. This is a historical practice that I have taken up more and more recently in my life. Just wearing little thin shirts that I've actually picked up at Uniqlo, I can link them below, under all my fancy stuff so that I don't have to worry about getting my fancy stuff dry cleaned all the time. But yes, marking my notches in for both of the princess seams along the front. I'm of course going to be sewing the sidemost piece to the center piece here first, because to sew the center front piece of the jacket on, I will have to have the rest of the jacket pretty much constructed. So I'll show you that when we get to it. Here's my side piece and my middle piece for one side of the jacket. You can go ahead and line those up along the notches and then along the rest of the seam. If I have to put in little clips along this curve, I will go ahead and do that within the seam allowance, because we all know how I believe in clipping a curve to make everything lie flat. The seams might not fit together very well when you're pinning them. If you don't put clips like this in, sometimes it's just necessary in a princess seam, even in a delicate fabric like this. It makes the sewing process much easier, and it sure makes for a smoother finish once you're pressing everything open. And over here on the machine, I'm using, of course, Gutermann all-purpose thread in the color black, 12 stitches per inch, and using my same half-inch seam allowance as I was using while pattern drafting, and usually use, at all times. I'll put a link to my princess seam video where I talk about this a little bit more, but I do find that sewing this style of princess seam, this is a double princess seam here today, so I'm doing two styles of princess seam in some ways, which means I have less curve to deal with in each because the amount of fullness between the two darts is being split between the two princess seams, so neither is particularly curvy to sew, which is nice. But the princess seam where one of the darts is swung up into that neckline is actually the easiest one to sew, so that was convenient for this. I will go ahead and press open my center back seam here. Most of this is straight until I get up to the very, very top of this. Press that on one side, press it on the other, make sure everything's behaving. And then I can press open the seam allowance here just to see how this is going to look since I left the rest of the seam open. The point where this seam stops and is open for the rest of the neckline isn't going to receive any tension, so I'm not actually worried about reinforcing that in any way other than having that little bit of interfacing that's in there, so should be fine. And I can go ahead and sew the back princess seams as well. You can put notches on these back princess seams too if you want to be able to line them up. The curve is subtle enough that I have never run into problems really, so I just wing it. And I'll press open my little peplum seams here as well. You can see because this silk is slightly striped that we're starting to see where the grain line is makes a difference in how this looks when it's finished, because of course there's a bit of a stripe to this fabric. The center back here you can see is on grain, and then the front piece, the center front, is on grain, so once they get sewn along a weird angle, they come together at strange ways. And here I'm just putting my pleats in, so I'm just using my pattern as a reference here. Of course, they pleat away to nothing at the waist, so there's no fullness being taken out at the waist seam. It's just a extra little pleat for funsies, not for fit, here along the back. And I'm going to flip that to the other side so I can sew the top of it shut over on the machine. So hopefully you can see what I did here. Again, this is another one where it's like hard to explain. I'm pinching my pleat closed here, making it behave. It's a little bit biasy right here, so it doesn't have any trouble. Pressing that into place so that it lines up with my pattern piece. And then I'm going to flip this over, come inside here, and just sew the top 2.5 inches of this closed. That stitching will not show on the outside, but it will just hold that pleat closed for the first couple of inches beyond my waist, which helps with a nice smooth fit back there, I suppose. You don't have to do that. You can just leave the pleat there, especially if you have a crispy fabric. And with my organza interlining in this, it probably would have stayed crispy, but it just means it's easier if I ever have to press this jacket if it gets rumpled in the future. That little bit of stitching in there will hold that in place without me having to really completely repleat the whole thing. And I will stitch my other princess seam here, so I'm just pinning that into place, and then back over here on the machine, I'm just stitching that again 3 inches here at the top of the pleat. It doesn't really matter if it's 2 inches or 3 inches, 6 inches, as long as you do it the same on both sides. And that, honestly, that doesn't even matter, really. You can do whatever you want. This is design. And just sewing my other princess seam here, just like I did the first side. Left and right here. I'm not sure which I did first, left or the right. Doesn't really matter. For once, a garment that is not asymmetric. I do use asymmetry quite a lot. I will use asymmetric embroidery on the back of this, as opposed to anything asymmetric in the actual body of the garment. So you can see, here's my little pleat along the back now, all sewn into place. What that looks like, just give that a nice press now that it's finished. I need to press my side back princess seams here. Now, again, normally I would clip this. This fabric is very loosely woven, and the muslin is actually very malleable as well, so I could get away with just pressing this and not having to clip this. Once again, if it doesn't look smooth on this side, go ahead and give it a couple of clips, but if it's looking fine, don't bother. The curvier a seam is, the more you need clips, which is why you have to clip a corner as well. If you think of a corner as being a 90-degree curve, like a very sharp curve, that's why you have to clip off so much from a corner, and that's why we have to clip our curves, because they are a shallow corner in some ways, if you think about it. But this princess seam along the back is a very shallow curve, and therefore I could get away, thanks to these malleable fabrics, of course 100% cotton muslin and then 100% silk here, in slightly looser weaves, that I could get away with not having to clip that one. But of course the front here, much curvier because we're dealing with the bust, so I do have to clip this. And often when doing princess seams, all the time here on the channel, you'll see me top stitch a princess seam open just to hold all these little flappies and bits in place and nice and smooth. So I'm using, you know, silk, fancier fabrics, making an evening jacket today. I didn't want to use top stitching on that. If I was making a jacket for daytime, I think it's perfectly acceptable to have top stitching on things like this. I'm trying to make it more of a design feature. So it's serving a practical purpose, but also using a contrast thread or doing like decorative top stitching to kind of make it part of the whole effect. Also because this jacket is interlined right here, if I wanted to go in here and whip stitch or like fell down this seam allowance just to the muslin layer with like a layer of cotton or silk thread, something really nice and smooth, you could totally do that as well. So this is a way you could quote unquote top stitch without having to top stitch, just fell down the seam allowance to just the interlining and it wouldn't be seen from the outside, but it would keep this completely smooth. Which is an idea I didn't have until just this moment. I didn't have time to do it for this jacket anyway, but maybe in the future. That's a pretty good idea. I didn't even think of that until looking at this now. Of course, there's the interlining right there. That's the best thing about using interlining is that you can do all kinds of invisible stuff on the inside. But luckily this is pretty crispy and stays in place once I have it pressed. I also need to go ahead and sew my underarm seam of my sleeves here, so I can go ahead and do that. You can see I interlined the sleeves here with a black cotton muslin. I do like getting black cotton muslin from Mood. They are currently out of stock because of course when I'm doing all these interlinings, it's usually for a project that, you know, incorporates black, because in my sewing room, things are usually a dark jewel tone or black, as we know. So it's nice to actually have natural undyed muslin for all of you, because it's probably easier to see what I'm doing on camera when I'm working on an actual muslin colored muslin. But of course I prefer black. Luckily for you, they are currently out of stock at Mood. Hopefully they'll get that back in. And yeah, it's really inexpensive. It's like $3, $4 a yard. So I use it to interline most of my costuming projects and fashion projects if I can get a hold of it. Pressing open that other back princess seam here. The back is all constructed and all together. Gosh, this fabric is pretty. It just glows like some sort of radioactive honey. It's delicious. And now with both sides of my front constructed, of course the center front pieces aren't on yet, I can go ahead and sew my side seams together for the fronts and the back, because again, I can't put my center front piece on until the peplum is on. So I have to sew these side seams on, then sew the peplum together, put the peplum on to the waist of the rest of this, and then I can sew that center front piece on. You'll see why when we line them up. But yes, the very center back of my peplum here, I'm just going to sew the top 4 or 5 inches or so. Again, I'm eyeballing this, not measuring it. So, you know, again, when I don't measure, it's coming out of confidence and having made so many things at this point. But it also just goes to show that you don't have to be super precise all the time for things to work out, you know? But I'll go ahead and sew my side seams for this jacket as well. And then while I'm here, I'm just going to go ahead and throw gathering into the sleeve caps of my sleeves here. Just 2 rows of gathering stitching. Of course, this is my largest stitch length on this machine, which is 6 stitches per inch, which is one of those things that's just impossible to say. 6 stitches per inch. But yes, in the center top caps of my sleeve here, putting in some gathering stitching so I can gather those down to fit into my arm side later. But just press open those side seams, and then I can again line my peplum up, and then I'll press open the center back of my peplum here for this jacket. It will no longer be a separate peplum, it will just be part of the jacket in 3, 2, 1, you know? Like so. That's what that's gonna look like. Make sure that silk is behaving. Thank you. So yes, I can line that up, line up the center back of the peplum with the center back of the jacket back, line up the pleats with the princess seams at the back. Then there is no side seam in this peplum piece, but there is in the jacket. Just skip over that and line up the first princess seam for the peplum and the jacket, and then just pin everything to fit in between, since there's no side seam to match up. I match up the seams that I can, and then I pin in between. That's best practice for this kind of thing, I suppose. Then I will sew that waist seam over here on the machine, back to my 12 stitches per inch, making sure my organza layer of this isn't separating from the rest. Please behave. I feel like this jacket went together really quickly when I was making it, but this video has turned out quite long, so perhaps this was more involved than I thought it was. I don't know. I am kind of used to making fancy jackets at this point though, so maybe, again, my confidence level for this has gone up, whereas it still takes a while to show you what I'm talking about. Now the center front seam, just like this seam line actually really reminds me of the Rick Owens inspired jackets that I made earlier in the year. So it kind of zigs and then zags back out. So instead of just having that princess seam curve over the bust, it also comes back out for the neckline a little bit, but just pin it into submission. This front princess seam here. Of course, again, because this piece is long and there is no waist seam on this center front piece of the jacket, I had to wait until the peplum was sewn to the breast before I could sew this on. Sewing over the bust there. Again, this is the easier princess seam. As you can see, that little bit of curve there wasn't much curve. I didn't have to clip this one to fit it in, that's for sure, because it's actually rather subtle when doing it this way. All the way down to the tippy point of the front of the jacket, like so. Take my pins back out. You can see I'm trying to sew over my pins less. I'm just trying to train myself because I'm tired of getting, bullied about it. But for seams like princess seams, I'm still going to sew over my pins. Not sorry. It's just easier, okay? Or I could like baste things, I guess. But once again, I'm too lazy for that. Clip my curves. Press things open. I really do need merch that says clip your curves. Really need to get on that. I'm sure some other sewist has done this in the history of time. But you can't copyright that, right? I just want like a death metal font that says clip your curves on like a mug. One day, perhaps. But now that I have that front sewn on, I can actually go ahead and sew my shoulder seam as well, which of course has this little curve in it, which I will need to clip, like so, and press over my tailor's ham. Press into place, and now that one side of the jacket is all together. Hooray! I mean, other than the sleeve, but, we'll get to it. One side of the jacket. I will do the same, shockingly, for the other side. So I need to, again, grab my other piece here, and again, I'm using pins to mark where I need to go ahead and match up my notches, which are drawn in colored pencil on the other piece. Match that up over the bust and sew that princess seam. And now I'm ready to set in my sleeves. So I'm going to go ahead and put the correct sleeve, like the right sleeve in the right armhole. This is always a challenge. That's why I like to leave myself little markers and stuff so I know what the heck I'm doing. I'm going to pin the underarm seam of my sleeve to the side seam of my jacket. And I'm going to pin up to where the gathering begins on each side. And then I'll gather the rest down to fit. This is how I like putting in gathered sleeves. And most sleeves, honestly. I always match up the underarm seam and the side seam first. Just grounding myself so I know where the heck I am. Line up the shoulder seam with the center as well, and then just gather everything else down to fit in to the arm side, like so. That's why I have my 2 lines of gathering stitching in here. I'm going to concentrate the puff at the top, maybe like 1 inch or so, and then just pin the rest of this down and do the other sleeve in the exact same way. Luckily, setting in a sleeve like this is no big deal. Again, I always say if you struggle with setting in sleeves, go with puff sleeves, even if it's only a little bit of puff at the top here, because it hides all mistakes. If your sleeve and your arm side are a little bit different in the end, no one would know when the sleeve is supposed to be a little bit bigger and you just gather it down to fit, But over here on the machine, I can go ahead and sew that sleeve into place. Please do forgive me if my voice still sounds a little strained. I am still recovering from a cold here, so when I wake up, I can't breathe, and then throughout the day it gets better, and then I have to go to bed again. And as soon as I lay down, my sinuses get angry. That's that. Like so. Yay, we have a little bit of puff at the top of our sleeve. Our sleeve is in. I will go ahead and clip this because, again, this is a rather dramatic curve. It's nearly a circle. I mean, no one's arm is a perfect circle, but you know what I mean. I will go ahead and press all that seam allowance into the sleeve, fill that sleeve with some steam from my iron, and press my tailor's ham in here. Just how I like to press this seam. Like so. Just make sure all that seam allowance is being puffed out into the sleeve because I'm going to go ahead and stick a whole lining in here, and this is all going to be encompassed in the lining anyhow, so just better if all that seam allowance goes into supporting the puff on the sleeve. And I will be putting a slight shoulder pad into this later. I'll show you how I do that as well. Now, for the lining of this jacket, I cut everything out of a black rayon Cupro. It's sort of like a rayon cotton blend weirdness fabric. It's basically a rayon made of cotton, if I'm understanding it properly. Twill lining here, but then I cut out the tops 4 inches or so of those in black silk. So I didn't have enough black silk to line the whole jacket in black silk, which would have been very fancy. So I'll just line this jacket in rayon, but for the tops of these pieces, I just went ahead and added a seam and switched to silk for the tops of these, where it will fold back and you will see the inside of the collar while I'm wearing the jacket. I wanted those to be silk as opposed to rayon. And for the closure of this jacket, I will need a little placket, sort of a modesty panel that this closes over. I will actually be sewing a bunch of buttons onto this so that this looks like it is a button closure, even though it's not. So I have a 3-inch wide by maybe 11 or 12-inch long rectangle right here. And this is 4 layers total. We have the muslin interlining here. We have the Yellowjacket silk that has a layer of fusible interfacing on it to stiffen that up. And then there is the black lining. We have interlining, we have interfacing, and we have lining itself. Sorry about that. But I will clip my corners and turn this right side out. Give it a nice press. Sometimes I put boning into these. There's a piece of boning sitting here. That's not because I'm using it for this one. That's just because I was using it to help poke out my corners. Because this is actually stiff enough all on its own. This placket doesn't need any extra structure. And here I am, yes, with my 5-layer cotton shoulder pads from moodfabrics.com. I'm just going to whip the outside edge of this down to the seam allowance in my sleeve here, because I want the shoulder pad to extend out into the sleeve a 1/2 inch. So I'm lining it up with the edge of the seam allowance, just throwing a couple of whip stitches in here. They're actually kind of loose because I don't want to constrict and like depuff the shoulder pad. So I'm just tacking these in here rather loosely. Again, it'll be between 2 layers. This will be between this jacket layer and the lining, so it's never going to have any friction against it really, especially because this again would be dry cleaned and or never thrown in a washing machine. If you're going to throw something in the washing machine, you'd probably want to secure your shoulder pads a little bit better. But I just tack mine in because I'm never planning on this being too rumpled. I guess maybe that's optimistic of me, but there you go. So yes, I've used pins to find the center of my shoulder pad here. The padded side goes into the sleeve puff and the tapered side goes along the shoulder. I'm tacking that to the seam allowance along the shoulder seam and to the seam allowance along the arm side. Next up, I'm going to go ahead and put the finished lining, which is assembled the same way as the rest of the jacket, except for with extra seams this time because I switched to the silk for the collars up here. Even more work for myself as usual. But I'll slip the lining into the rest of the jacket, right sides together, and I'm going to completely pin around the edges here and backline this jacket. All around the various corners and curves and straight bits and not straight bits for this. There's going to be a tiny opening at the top back neckline as well, just like the center back peplum. I will just go ahead and finish that last little bit off with some hand stitching later. Of course, once I have this lining all sewn, I need to go ahead and clip my curves and my corners. So I'll go around doing that, making sure everything will behave in the end. Again, this is another thing where normally I will turn this right side out and I will top stitch the edges. For this, I'm only going to top stitch this right where it will be along the placket and attached to the placket. And that is going to be completely covered by the buttons anyway. So it's just there for structure as opposed to for style. Again, I'm working with a very crispy fabric today. The silk and the cotton iron really well, so I'm not worried about them puffing up at the edges or anything. And once I have this turned all right side out, everything is finished except for those little sections I need to close up as I'm slip stitching at the center back, neckline, and hem. But I do still need to hem my sleeves. So I've turned those in on themselves. And I'm actually just going to line these with a little bit of silk bias tape because it's easier when you have a shaped hem like this to line it with bias than to try and make these things behave. And I can finally start thinking about embellishing this jacket. That's right. Now I'm going to grab my little cicada outlines from when I did the cicadas down the back of my cicada gown. They're still sitting in my pattern, so I grabbed those out of there, and I'm going to trace those onto this black taffeta. You can see I have just scraps of black taffeta left. Not enough to line the jacket, but enough to line the cicadas down the back, so that's good. I am tracing these all in the same grain, so the stripes of the silk all go in the same direction. They're not like even stripes. It's obviously just like a mixture of colors, but I wanted the grain line of all those to be the same. And instead of cutting out the cicadas, you're just going to leave them rectangles. Layer the two pieces up and sew along the traced shape that you want. Of course, remember to leave a small, like 1-inch opening in this so you can turn it right side out. But definitely cut them out after you have sewn the two layers together It's just about a million times easier. So here I'm using my regular fabric scissors to go ahead and cut these out. If you have smaller embroidery scissors, that works for this too. Kind of a little detailed work here. Like so. I'm cutting this out with maybe a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Very little seam allowance, especially in this loosely woven silk. Playing a dangerous game, as it were. Again, this is something that will, once these are sewn on, never get any tension, unless they get caught on something or something. So I'm not worried about them pulling apart, luckily. I have a little paintbrush here to go ahead and poke the shape into place. It's basically doing applique, but the entire applique is hemmed, if that makes sense. So I bag lined the cicada just the same way I bag lined the jacket, honestly. I just need to turn in my little bits along the opening and slip stitch that shut. And I have my little puffy cicada guy. Isn't he cute? I love these guys. I could have done bats as well. I did bats on that poly shantung jacket. Was that last year? Last year. I would say there's many different shape options for doing this. But truly, before I can start embellishing, I do need to finish the closure on this jacket. So I have my little placket. I'm going to line that up along the center front of the left-hand side of my jacket. I will underlap that like a 1/2 inch here. And then I'm going to top stitch and sew this down all in one. So I'm going to top stitch right along the edge of the jacket, an 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. And that will secure this placket onto here. I am stitching quite close to the edge of the jacket, so that again, this line of stitching is completely covered by the buttons I'll be using as my illusion closure along this placket later. All along the front of the jacket here. Stops about where my collarbone is, so the rest of the collar is just free on its own. I'm going to go ahead and close this up with skirt hooks. I thought this was a good idea. We all know how I love a skirt hook, so we'll use those on this. The other jackets I've actually used hook and eyes, and I do like them better. So I never used skirt hooks, and now I know that I prefer hook and eyes. And so for the future, I will use hook and eyes instead of skirt hooks for the front closure on these. And then again, yes, once I have my hooks in place, I'm going to sew about 20-ish, 20 odd buttons. These are radium polished buttons from the 1920s, all down the placket here, so that it looks like this closes with buttons without having to do 24 buttonholes or whatever, which would be kind of a nightmare in this silk, as we can all imagine. Even sewing on this many buttons takes a while, let alone doing buttonholes as well. Then I can line up my finished silk cicadas down the center back of my jacket, pin those in place. I need to leave an opening down the center of this, so I can slip through that ribbon that's going to go down the center of this to create the really textured spinal look to this. So I'm just pinning these about 1 inch out from the center back on either side, and I'm just going to throw in a few tiny stitches here to tack these down. Luckily, because of the texture of the Dupioni and the fact that it has black in the weave, these stitches are really not seen in the end. And once I have those secured on, I just have a 4-inch wide strip of silk. This is just a single layer of the silk. And I've pulled some of the extra threads away from the edges so that it's like fringed like this. That's just the weave of the silk poking through. I thought it'd be fun to have a little bit of fringiness going on. I'm just going to weave that through and loop it through each cicada, creating a little bit of like a puffy balloon knot for the body of each of these little bugs down my center back. It is me, after all, you know? And this just gets tacked at the top and bottom. You could stitch this down as much as you wanted to. I didn't feel it was necessary along the whole length of it. It stays in place thanks to the cicadas being secured down. And of course, yes, moths, butterflies, birds, like angel wings. Using a contrast color of fabric, using a sheer fabric, a matte versus shiny. There are a lot of options for using the same sort of decoration style down the center back. Or anywhere else for that matter. And of course, in the original 1870s dress and the Crimson Peak dress that was inspired by it, this goes down past the waist along the back of the dress a little bit further. And then it was time to finish the embellishment of this jacket by sewing on lots and lots of sequins to the back. That's right. I'm still doing my sort of klimped-ish geometric patterning on this. It's a little bit more freeform and asymmetric as to where I put them and which sections I chose to fill in. It's not symmetrical at all. It's just kind of filling in between the cicadas, like in between every other cicada, left and right across the back. And I'm using sequins to do this. I'm using this is actually a glass flat-backed jet bead that I think is probably from the 1920s, just like these buttons. So I'm throwing on some vintage beads back here, some rectangular sort of corrugated metal looking sequins, and then I actually cut some sequins, or like cut embellishments, out of both velvet ribbon and also black felt for a different texture. So instead of just using glass beads and shiny black sequins, I also have matte sequins at my disposal because at this point I've collected most types of sequins because I'm a magpie, as we know. But I'm using some glass beads, sequins, and then also tiny pieces of felt, tiny pieces of velvet to do all my embellishment on the back of this. I also did use some black spider-shaped sequins on this, so I will link those below. They are from Cartwright's Sequins. No surprise there, one of my favorite sequin shops. And then around each of these little zones of embellishment, I kind of faded them out into nothing by using tiny, tiny size 15 Charlotte cut seed beads. I'm using a beading needle and black thread to do all of this, the same black thread that I used to construct the jacket. I have a lot of black Gutermann thread on hand because I go through a lot of it, as you can imagine. But yes, there's no pattern or rhyme or reason to this. I'm just making it up as I go along. I did use a little arrangement of sequins and beads that looked a little bit like a resting beetle to me to secure down the wingtips of the cicada all along the back of the jacket as well. I like to secure those down instead of having the cicada wings smooth across the back, which is an option. I like to have a little bit of puff again and a little bit of texture in that. It really reinforces the kind of spinal skeletal look down the center back of a jacket like this. And at this point, when I didn't have a lot of embellishment on, I was like, is this working? And then as soon as I stepped away, went and had dinner, came back, got a look at it from farther away, I really liked it. So that was good because I did several hours of work and thought, do I even like where this is going? And in the end, I really love this jacket. I'm so excited to wear this out. I did take about an entire day. I think I did a few hours in the evening and then the next entire day I was spent embellishing this. So it was probably 8 or 10 hours of sequining and hand embellishing on this buddy. Again, when I'm stitching these on, I am stitching them through just the outer layer of silk. So I'm not stitching these all the way through the lining. I'm just being careful to only catch the silk and maybe the interlining and not the actual rayon lining itself of the jacket. So none of these stitches will show on the inside. A lot of times in couture, well, most of the time in actual couture and even ready to wear, 90% of the embellishment is done beforehand, before the construction of the garment itself. And so that's why it all has to be planned and patterned out. I kind of like the freedom it gives me embellishing afterwards, being able to decide on the fly what I like instead of having to decide before I even start putting the project together. But seeing as past me still has a lot of work to do here, let's go ahead and skip forward in time and I'll show you what the back of this looks like all finished up. And here is my finished tricolor silk Dupioni jacket with all of its embellishment down the back. I am super thrilled with how this came out. This is another jacket pattern I can definitely see myself using again and again, like the verdigris jacket. I think the Terry Mugler inspiration is pretty lost in here unless you are quite the Mugler expert while looking at this, but of course I'm always inspired by style lines because Mugler was the king of an hourglass-shaped suit, and we all know how I love one of those. Thank you again to my patrons for letting me share some of these videos from the vault with you here on the channel to give myself a little bit more time this year. And thank you all, as always, for watching this video today. I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye!